April 2, 1959. The lounge of the Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, the clinking of crystal, the low hum of privilege, the sweet smell of bourbon and regret. She was new, a cocktail waitress, maybe 19, with wide eyes that hadn't yet learned the art of looking without seeing. She carried a tray of martinis, the olives trembling like tiny green hearts, toward a booth shrouded in cigar smoke. Inside that cloud sat a man who owned pieces of this town, pieces of its lights, its debts, its silence. His name was Louis the Lip Drago, and he had a taste for humiliation disguised as humor. He called her over. His voice, a gravelly whisper, cut through the piano music. He asked for a maraschino cherry. She apologized, they didn't have any. He asked again, slower. She apologized again, her smile brittle. The men at his table grew still. This was the game. The third time he asked, he wasn't asking. He was building a trap. And then he told her, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, that if she couldn't find a cherry, she'd have to get on her knees and pretend to be one. Laughter, sharp and hollow, erupted from his booth. The girl froze, her face a mask of hot shame, the tray shaking in her hands. She was utterly, terribly alone. But she was. From a shadowed banquette nearby, a man watched. Dean Martin, Dino. He was in the middle of a story, his hand gesturing lazily, a glass of amber liquid catching the low light. He stopped. His eyes, usually glazed with a charming, deliberate indifference, cleared, focused. He saw the girl's trembling chin. He saw Drago's cruel, triumphant smirk. And in that moment, Dean Martin made a choice that defied every unspoken law of the neon jungle. He stood up. The music from the piano seemed to fade. Every eye in the lounge tracked him as he moved, not toward the exit, not toward the stage, but directly toward that cloud of smoke and power. He walked with a casual saunter, but his jaw was set. He stopped at the waitress's side, gently took the heavy tray from her hands and set it on the edge of the table. Then he turned to Louis Drago. The room held its breath. This was more than chivalry. This was a declaration of war in a war nobody won. Because Dean Martin knew a secret buried in the desert sand and sealed with blood. He knew that to protect this stranger, he would have to confront the very monster that had been protecting him for a decade. And that monster never forgot a slight. This is the story they tried to scrub from the records. The night the King of Cool decided to burn his own crown to keep a single flame of decency alive. It's a story that begins not in Vegas, but in the smoky, desperate alleys of Cleveland, in a childhood so poor that shame was a luxury he couldn't afford. It's about the deals you make before you're famous enough to understand the cost. And it's about the one moment when the bill comes due, and a man must decide if he's still the person he promised himself he'd never become. This is the confession Dean Martin never gave, told through the cracks in his smile, the tremor in his hand as he lifted a glass, and the silent screams of a history Hollywood was too frightened to film. To understand why that moment in the sands was a suicide note written in gesture, you have to go back to the steel gray skis of Steubenville, Ohio, to a boy named Dino Crosti, who spoke only Italian until he was 5, who wore the poverty of the Great Depression like a second skin. His father, a barber, looked at the world with a weary disappointment. Young Dino learned early that the world was divided between those who got humiliated and those who did the humiliating. He vowed in the quiet of his shared bedroom to never be in the first group. He found his armor in a smile, a disarming, easy grin that said nothing could touch him. He carried it with him into the illegal backroom boxing matches, taking punches for $10 a round. He carried it into the gambling dens, dealing cards and learning to read the subtle tells of dangerous men. He carried it onto the stages of third-rate Cleveland nightclubs, singing while drunks threw bottles. The smile was his weapon, his shield, his product. It said, "I'm having a wonderful time and your cruelty is just background noise." But inside, the boy from Steubenville was always watching, always calculating the power in the room. He saw how the mobsters moved with an unshakable certainty. They owned the doors, the liquor, the silence. They were the real kings of the night. And a part of him, the desperate part that never forgot the taste of hunger, admired it. He didn't want to be a gangster. He wanted to be untouchable, like them. The path to that untouchable status led through Hollywood, but it was paved by the mob. In the late 1940s, as Martin and Lewis became a supernova, their bookings were handled by the William Morris Agency, but their protection, their *guaranteed reception in every city from New York to Miami, was brokered in backrooms by men with names like Golf Bag and Trigger. Dean knew who was signing the checks behind the scenes. He'd have a drink with them. He'd accept their gifts, a case of scotch, a diamond pinky ring for good luck. They were fans, they said, just looking out for a paisan. The smile never wavered. Thank you, Gracie. It was the cost of doing business in a business built on sand, but with every gift a thread was tied, a silent, invisible filament of obligation. Then came Vegas. In 1952, the Sands Hotel opened, and it was more than a casino. It was a sovereign state, and its ministers were the Rat Pack, with Frank Sinatra as its exuberant, chaotic president. But its shadow king was a man named Mo Dalitz, a Cleveland mobster, Dean's old Cleveland asterisk. The threads suddenly pulled taut. Dalitz and his partners didn't just own the Sands, they were the Sands. And Dean Martin, the beloved crooner, the king of the Copa Room, was their brightest star. His contract was a golden leash. He packed the house. He made the tills sing. He was family, and in this family, you didn't embarrass the elders. You didn't contradict them in public. You certainly didn't intervene when they decided to discipline the help. Louis Drago was no Mo Dalitz. He was a mid-level lieutenant, a boastful, violent man with a chip on his shoulder the size of the Vegas Strip. He craved respect from the icons he was paid to protect. He saw Dean at the peak of his fame, the movies, the records, the adoring crowds, and he seethed with a kind of possessive jealousy. We made you asterisk, that jealousy whispered. We can unmake you asterisk. Drago's humiliation of the waitress that April night wasn't just cruelty, it was a flex. A demonstration of absolute power in the kingdom Dean inhabited. It was a test, and Dean failed it. The lounge was a cathedral of tension. Dean looked at Drago. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply spoke, his voice a low, calm baritone that carried in the dead silence. Louis, he said, the lady said they don't have cherries. Why don't you try the fruit salad? I hear it's ripe. A few stifled gasps. It wasn't the words. It was the tone, dripping with a disdain so pure it burned. It was Dean looking at the mobster and seeing not a power but a pathetic small man. He then turned to the waitress. Honey, you look beat. Take the rest of the night off. Tell him at the front Dino says your shift's covered. He pulled $100 bill from a money clip, a clip Drago himself had likely given him as a Christmas gift, and pressed it into her hand. For your trouble. Drago's face went from smug to purple. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the tile. This was an atomic insult, a public stripping of his authority. For a second, it looked like violence was inevitable. Dean didn't flinch. He just stared, his famous smile gone, replaced by something colder, older. The look of the Steubenville boxer who'd taken punches from men far harder than Louis Drago. It was Drago who looked away first, muttering a curse as he stormed out, his goons scrambling after him. The lounge exhaled a collective, shaky breath. Piano music tentatively started again. Dean returned to his table, picked up his drink, and took a long, slow sip. His hand, his friends would note later, was perfectly steady, but his eyes were miles away. The deed was done. The line was crossed. And in the underworld economy of respect, a debt had just been called in. Only this time, Dean was the one who would have to pay. But that public stand was just the spark. The true explosion happened in the silence that followed, the phone calls that didn't come, the sudden scheduling conflicts with his lucrative New Year's Eve slot, the mysterious pressure from the studio on his next film, Ocean's 11 *, a film financed in part by the very shadows he'd just insulted. Frank Sinatra, his brother in arms, pulled him aside. Frank, who navigated these waters with a frantic, complicated dance of his own. Drago, Frank said, using the old nickname, his voice uncharacteristically grave. You can't do that. You can't just do that. Dean just looked at him, that empty, cool look returning. I just did, Pally. The rift wasn't with Frank, but with the system. They were putting the squeeze on him. The message was clear: apologize, make it right, humble yourself to Drago. And here is where the secret, the real devastating core of this story, tightens like a vice. Dean Martin refused, not with bluster but with a quiet, terrifying resolve. He didn't apologize. He didn't send a conciliatory bottle of champagne to Drago's suite. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He started to pull away. He began to sever the very threads that had built him. His drinking, always a part of his persona, took on a new quality. It wasn't just for show anymore. It was an anesthetic. He'd perform his legendary shows at the Sands, the room roaring with laughter at his drunk act, and then he'd retreat to his suite and stare at the desert night, sober and silent, for hours. The smile became a monument, empty, beautiful, haunting. The pressure escalated. A week after the incident, Dean arrived at the Sands to find his usual dressing room occupied by a third-rate comic from Chicago. A mistake, management said. Then his favorite pianist, a man who knew his every vocal cue, was suddenly booked elsewhere. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a mob specialty. They were isolating him, making the stage he loved feel cold and hostile. And then, the final, chilling warning. He found it on the driver's seat of his car, a sleek, beautiful convertible. Not a threat, not a dead fish. A single, pristine maraschino cherry, sitting on a folded napkin from the Sands lounge. It was a masterpiece of menace. It said, "We are everywhere, we remember everything, and we own the very joke you tried to stop." That was the moment those close to him confided years later that something in Dean Martin broke for good, not his courage but his faith. The belief that he could navigate this world and stay clean. The cherry was a symbol of his powerlessness. He had stepped in to stop a humiliation, and they had turned the symbol of that humiliation into a weapon against him. He didn't go to the police. Of course he didn't. The police in Vegas in 1959 were often just men in different uniforms on the same payroll. He carried the weight alone. The performances grew more technically perfect, yet emotionally distant. He was a ghost in the machine of his own fame. He began to plan his exit, not from Vegas, but from the dependency. He renegotiated his contract with the Sands with a cold, hard eye, leveraging his star power to remove the clauses that tied him to specific service providers for security and transportation, providers with mob ties. He started investing his money quietly, cleanly, far from the casino bosses. He was disentangling himself, thread by painful thread, knowing that a single snap could mean ruin or worse. The climax of this silent war didn't come with gunfire or a headline-making brawl. It came at a private, high-stakes poker game in the summer of 1960. The game was held in the penthouse of the Desert Inn. Dean was there, so was Mo Dalitz. And so, in a chair by the bar, sat Louis Drago. The air was thick with cigar smoke and unspoken words. The game went on for hours, fortunes shifting on the turn of a card. Dean played well, his face a mask of relaxed indifference. Then, during a break, Dalitz motioned Dean over to a secluded balcony overlooking the glittering strip. The old mobster didn't mention the waitress. He didn't mention Drago. He just talked about respect. The old world kind. He talked about loyalty. And then he said, his voice softer than Dean had ever heard it, "Dino, you're a good boy, but you gotta understand. This town, it's a watch. And every gear, no matter how small, gotta turn with the others. You can't just stop a gear because you don't like the sound it makes." It wasn't a threat. It was a lament, a confession from a king who was also a prisoner. Dean looked out at the lights, the empire built on sand and suffering. He simply nodded. "I understand, Mo," and he did. He understood that he would never truly be free, but he could be autonomous. He could build a fortress so high and so clean that their shadows could only fall at its feet, never cross its threshold. He walked back into the penthouse. As he passed Drago's chair, he stopped. He didn't look at the man. He reached into the bowl of bar snacks on the table next to him, picked out a single salted almond and popped it into his mouth. Then finally he glanced down at Drago. A ghost of the old, cruel Steubenville smile touched his lips. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The message was delivered. "I see you. You are nothing to me, not even a cherry, just a snack." Drago visibly shrunk in his chair. The power balance, in that utterly silent exchange, had permanently shifted. Dean had won not by confrontation, but by transcendent indifference. He had made himself, in their own terms, untouchable. The aftermath was a lifetime of quiet victory and profound loneliness. Dean Martin became one of the first major stars to truly break the mob's operational hold on his career. He built a legendary solo act, ruled television, and became an icon. But those who knew him best, his son, his closest confidants, saw the scar tissue. The incident at the Sands was the last time he ever directly intervened in someone else's public humiliation. He had learned the cost was too high, not for him, but for them. His charity became anonymous, massive, and quiet. His famous detachment wasn't just a shtick. It was a survival mechanism perfected in a war no one saw. He would perform, tell his jokes, sing "Everybody Loves Somebody," and then retreat into a solitude so complete it was like a vault. The boy from Steubenville had finally built a wall no one could breach, but he had to live alone inside it. Hollywood, of course, buried the truth. They sold the story of the lovable drunk, the carefree crooner. They turned his deep, strategic silence into a punchline. The mob, for its part, was happy to let that legend stand. It was safer. The real story of a man who stared down the darkness not with fists, but with an unforgivable act of public decency and spent the rest of his life paying the private price, was too dangerous, too human, too real. It was a story that proved the system could be beaten, but it would claim a piece of your soul as its toll. So the next time you see that clip of Dean Martin, glass in hand, smile lazily plastered on his face, remember the cherry, remember the waitress, remember the silence that followed his courage. Look into his eyes, past the twinkle, and you might just see the reflection of a deserted balcony in Vegas and a man measuring the distance between the person he was supposed to be and the man he decided to become. He saved a waitress from a moment of shame, and in doing so, condemned himself to a lifetime of understanding the price of a conscience in a town that traded in their absence. That's the real Dean Martin story, not a biography, a confession, whispered in the space between a note held too long and a smile that arrived a second too late. This is the kind of history they hide in plain sight, in a glance, in a gesture, in the things a man refuses to do. At Hollywood Untold Files, we don't just tell the stories of legends. We listen for the silence between their words. We look for the cracks in the golden facade, and what we find there is always more heartbreaking and more true than the fairy tales they sold us. If you're still here, you understand that. You're one of us now, so help us keep digging. Subscribe and join us next time when we turn over another stone and find the Hollywood that was never meant to see the light.